I'd like to briefly cover different components of the user interface. But before we get into the user interface, I'd like to explain how we can turn off and on certain aspects of the UI. And that way you can be working with the exact same user interface that we'll be working with throughout this DVD. The first thing I'm going to do is go up to Display, down to UI Elements, and over to Show UI Elements. When I click on that, that should bring up all your user interface elements. Now, the other thing that you may want to do, just so you're on the same page with us while we're working on this DVD, is you might want to go to Windows, down to Settings and Preferences, and over to Preferences. And that's going to open up your preference window, which we're not really going to work with too much on this DVD. But there is this Edit option right up here. So we can do an Edit, Restore Default Settings. And that's going to set everything back to normal as far as when you installed Maya for the very first time. That way none of your tools will act weird or funky while we're working on this tutorial. So our first part of the UI is this main menu bar here sitting at the top. And this is going to have some familiar components like File, Edit, Modify, Create, Display, and Windows will always stay up here no matter what. But these other options here will change depending on the menu sets that we change to. So we'll be referring to this very often as we work on different tutorials. Right below the main menu bar we have the status line. Now, we're not going to go into all the details of the user interface. That would just take too long right now and wouldn't make a lot of sense. We'll go over it as it's important with the tutorials we work on, but I do want you to know the names of it. This being the status line, we have some masking tools, which allows us to mask what we can select, some snap tools, which can turn on grid snapping, curve snapping, point snapping. We have some of our render options over here. Again, these things might not make sense to you now, but as we go through them, they'll be explained. Inside the status line, we do have these little kind of lines here. If you click on them, that'll close down and open up certain components. So in case you're working and don't see the same things that we're working with, you might want to click on those little lines to open up and close down these shelves. Now that we're in the status line, let's take a look at our menu set, which is this little white box over here, and by default it's going to say animation. Now if I open this up, you're going to see a few different menu sets in here: animation, polygons, surfaces, dynamics, rendering, cloth, and customize. Now depending on what version of Maya you're using and whether you're on a Mac or a PC, these menu sets are going to be a little bit different. If you're below version 8, you're going to have maybe polygons in here. If you're version 8 and above, you might have surfaces, or you might have modeling menu set in here if you're below version 8. But version 8 and above, we're going to have polygons and surfaces, so just keep note of that. Now if I change from animation over to polygons, you'll notice right up here that our File, Edit, Modify, and Create, and Display and Windows stay the same, but this Mesh, Edit Mesh, Proxy has all changed. So as we're working on different tutorials, we might switch over to Dynamics, and we'll get a few dynamic options up here. Nothing else in the UI changes, but this main menu bar does change as we change these different menu sets here. So just go back to animation. Next we have the shelf. And above the shelf we have shelf tabs. Currently I'm on my polygon shelf tab, which gives me access to different polygon primitives and also different polygon modeling tools. I can click on something like the fur, so we can have access to different furs, or dynamics, or maybe paint effects, and so on and so forth. So it's just a really quick way to gain access to all the different tools that you may access inside Maya. Now you might not see these shelf tabs up here. You might just see a single animation shelf or a default shelf. If you look over here on the right, you'll have a little folder with a dark arrow underneath it. If we click on that, we can turn on or off shelf tabs. So in case you don't have your shelf tabs open, just come over to that folder and that arrow and click on shelf tabs so you can open them up. Next, over here on the side, we have our toolbox. We're going to be using this very, very often. This gives us tools like our select tool, a move tool. If I had an object here inside my scene, you can see I can gain access to move tool, our rotate tool, our scale tool. So this over here on the side is the toolbox. This last little kind of empty area in the toolbox is reserved for the last tool used. So if we did an operation like extrude or merge edge, you'd see that tool from our shelf loaded down here. It's just a real convenient way to quickly gain access to the tool that we're using very often. Right below the toolbox we have a few views laid out. Currently we are in our single perspective view. I can click on the button right below, which is the 4 view, and you'll see we get our perspective, our top, our front, and our side. I'm just going to bring my mouse over my perspective and tap spacebar to move into this view. We'll talk more about switching between the panels in a little bit. Just know that you can gain access to different view layouts here, like the perspective, 4-panel view, outliner, and perspective. If we're going to do some animation, we might do a perspective and graph editor, perspective and hypershade in case we're doing some texturing. So just a real quick way to organize your workspace into the most convenient set of tools that you need to be working on. So we'll just go back to our perspective. Right below that we have our time slider. This is what we're going to be using to create animations here inside Maya. Right now by default it's set to 24 frames, and you'll notice right below that we have our range slider. And our range slider has some options over here on these white little boxes saying 24 and 48. Currently we have 24 frames loaded in. If I type in the number 200 for this first box and hit enter, I now have 200 frames loaded in my animation. Again, we'll cover more of this later. Next we have the command line. What the command line allows us to do is type in mel scripts, quick mel scripts that we can use to drive things inside our scene. Now mel stands for Maya Embedded Language. If you open up your script editor over here to the right, which is just kind of this little double box, inside the script editor we're now looking at mel. We can also type in mel commands here in this input area. Just a little quick preview of what that is. And next to that we have the help line. The help line, this kind of dark gray area, is going to give us all sorts of information about any errors that we may have in our scene, any options that we need to complete as far as completing tools. So if I were to type something here in the command line, an inappropriate piece of code, you're going to notice over here that we do have that error showing up, showing us what's going on. One more thing about our timeline up here, I forgot to point out the play controls. We do have play forward, play all the way to the end of the timeline. We have move forward 1 keyframe. We'll review more of this later. Over on the right hand side of my user interface we have something that we're going to be using very often. This is called the channel box. And the channel box is going to have all sorts of attributes changing in it all the time. Think of it as a kind of a toolbox that you can open up and gain access to different tools for different objects. Currently here at the top of the channel box we have the most commonly keyable attributes: translate, rotate, scale, visibility. We can turn those things on and off. As I move this object around my scene or scale it, you can see that the scale changes. If I decide to move it, you can see that the translate changes, and of course if I decide to rotate it, you'll notice that the rotation values of course update here in the channel box as well. You can click inside the channel box on one of the sets of numbers there, and I'll just type in, let's say, the number 20, and we'll get that sphere moving over 20 units from where the point of origin, which is in the center of the grid here inside our work area. You can click drag over a few of these boxes. So for translate, I'll just type in the number 0 for X, Y, and Z and hit enter, and you notice that this is back in the origin. I can click drag over scale and X, Y, and Z. I'll type in 1, we'll get that back to its original creation size, and we can of course type in 0 for all of the rotational axes. So what's really great about this, if you want to specifically rotate an object, let's say 90 degrees, as I rotate it here in Z, I can just come over to the channel box and type in 90, and there we go, we have this sphere rotated 90 degrees. Now I'd like to point out how we can close down some of these windows and gain access to them. As I pointed out already, we can go to display UI elements and go to show UI elements or restore UI elements. But for instance, quick access to things like the channel box, if we lose it, is this top right icon. And this is something you're going to want to remember because we do use the channel box very often. If I click on this icon here to the top right, it's going to open up the channel box, and if nothing's selected, you'll actually see an empty channel box. But if we have an object, a curve, a light selected, you're going to see attributes that are associated with that node here inside the channel box. You'll also notice that you have your polygon object name here at the bottom. We have polysphere 1. I can click on that and then come in here and change some of the attributes. Now you'll notice I'm not actually typing in a number. The way that we can interactively change things here in the channel box is by clicking on the word, so rotation in Z, and then middle mouse button clicking and dragging inside your workspace, and that'll allow you to interactively update what's going on here in the channel box. We can also right click on a lot of these options here and choose a bunch of different attributes that we'll talk about later. One that we'll use very often is key selected, setting a keyframe for that specific attribute. So to close down this window, I can just click on this double dotted line that I see above any of these windows. So if I click on that, it'll disappear, freeing up my workspace. I have a double dotted line here next to my time slider. I'll click on that, and my range slider, and you could just keep freeing up your workspace until you pretty much are only working with your work area, making it nice and clean for you to work with. But let's quickly bring back the channel box so I can point out one more attribute down here. Down here below the channel box we have the layer editor. Now if you're familiar with programs like Photoshop, you understand the concept of layers. If you're not, let me explain it this way. Think of the layer editor as a bookshelf that has a whole bunch of different shelves inside of it where we can store different objects or different lights or pretty much anything that you see inside your scene that you can select. So for instance, I have this sphere inside my scene. I'll go over to this layer editor and click on the word layers. Then I'm going to create an empty layer. With this object selected, I'm going to right click over this word layer and I'm going to add selected object. Now that I've done that, I can click on the letter V and turn that off or on. I can even click this empty box here in the middle, which will template or reference. Again, we'll talk about all that later. And you can create pretty much as many layers as you want. So I'll create a second layer. You can even double click on these words, choose a color, and even name your layer anything you want, and then just store multiple objects in different layers. This helps us organize our scene a lot better than just keeping millions of objects floating around. So that's just a quick run through of the user interface. I know that was a bit fast and could be a bit confusing at this point, but I just definitely wanted you to know the general terminology and name of all these aspects that we're going to be working. We're going to definitely understand these a lot more as we work through this DVD and we refer to the different pieces of the UI.